Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Highland Mystery. Oliver here. Loch's Harbour is used to storms, but not to a man who thinks he can audit the sea. When a controlling marine compliance assessor arrives to threaten local livelihoods and humiliate the fishermen, the village bristles with outrage. But the tides of resentment turn deadly when the assessor pushes his authority one step too far. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I'm doing here. Tell us where you are and what time it is in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and let's get started tonight. Chapter 1. The Man Who Measured Everything. The wind worried the heavy ropes mooring the fishing boats to the stone pier of Loch Harbour. It was mid-afternoon, and the salt air carried the sharp scent of brine and a damp chill that warned of a thick fog bank waiting its turn off the coast. The village of Loch, a neat row of whitewashed cottages facing the sea loch, usually enjoyed a quiet and measured pace. Today, however, the waterfront was crackling with tension. Police Sergeant Hamish Macbeth stood near the top of the slipway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his uniform tunic. He was a tall, gangling Highlander with fiery red hair and hazel eyes that currently held a look of profound weariness. He watched the source of the village unrest march down the wooden pier. Graham Tolland was a visiting marine compliance assessor. He wielded a large aluminium clipboard as though it were a broadsword and possessed a voice that sounded exactly like a snapped ruler. He wore a pristine, bright yellow waterproof jacket that made him look like a very angry canary. "This vessel is entirely substandard," Tolland barked, pointing a rigid pen at Archie McLean. "I can and will ground you for these infractions." Archie, the primary fisherman in Loch, paused in the act of unloading a heavy stack of creels. His weathered face darkened to the colour of old mahogany. "There is nothing wrong with my boat that a bit of time and elbow grease will not fix," Archie said, his voice a low rumble. "Time is not a regulatory compliance excuse," Tolland snapped, scribbling furiously on his paperwork. "You have frayed lines, improper stowage of hazardous materials, and your safety buoys are faded beyond the legal tolerance. I am writing up a formal suspension order." Hamish sighed softly. His dog, Lugs, was sprawled like an old hearth rug across the warm wooden planks of the pier. The large, odd-looking mongrel functioned as a living roadblock. Tolland turned sharply on his heel and was forced to step awkwardly around the sleeping dog, his sharp face tightening with offended dignity. From atop a thick coil of thick mooring rope, Hamish's Wildcat, Sonsi, watched the assessor. Her wild yellow eyes were bright, fierce, and entirely untrusting. She looked entirely ready to remove a piece of the man's leg if he came any closer. "Now, Mr. Tolland," Hamish said, keeping his Highland lilt mild and soothing as he stepped forward. "There is no need to be threatening a man's livelihood on a Tuesday afternoon. Archie has been fishing these waters since before you were born." "I do not threaten, Sergeant Macbeth," Tolland replied coldly, adjusting his spectacles. "I audit. The sea does not forgive carelessness, and neither do I. If the fishermen of this village cannot adhere to basic national standards, they have no business operating a commercial vessel." Hamish knew genuine trouble when it wore a neat, waterproof jacket. News of this ruthless inspector was already moving through the village. Nessie and Jessie Curry, the local spinster sisters, had been walking past the harbour only 20 minutes earlier. By now, the gossip would have travelled from the waterfront straight to Patel's general store. The rumours would spread faster than a winter flu in a closed schoolroom. The entire village would soon know exactly how thoroughly Tolland was humiliating the locals. A young deckhand named Tommy, barely out of school, nervously dropped a small coil of rope near the edge of the pier. Tolland immediately rounded on the boy, lecturing him loudly about trip hazards, sheer incompetence, and the statistical likelihood of drowning. Tommy flushed a deep, painful red and stared at his boots, entirely mortified. Hamish felt a familiar, cold dread settle heavily in his stomach. It was not just Graham Tolland causing him grief today. Only that morning, Hamish had received a telephone call from police headquarters in Inverness. His name was officially under consideration for a promotion. It was a threat he dreaded more than almost anything else. A promotion meant a desk in a loud city, far from the quiet waters, green hills, and familiar faces of Lochs. Chief Inspector Blair down in Strathbane treated the prospect of Hamish leaving like a winning lottery ticket. Blair hated Hamish with a passion and wanted him gone. If Hamish handled this harbour dispute too efficiently, Inverness would hear of it and move him up the ladder. If he let the situation explode into violence, Blair would descend on the village to make his life completely miserable. It was a trap with no easy exit. Hamish needed a distraction to clear his head. He glanced toward the edge of the water near the secondary slipway. A harried harbour worker was busy repainting Buoy 7. It was a large, battered metal float that marked a particularly tricky snag in the harbour. The worker slapped fresh, bright green paint onto the metal surface. The paint looked incredibly thick and tacky. Hamish watched as the worker accidentally brushed his bare knuckles against the rim of the buoy. The fresh green paint peeled away instantly, leaving distinctive crescent-shaped chips sticking stubbornly to the man's skin and the nearby mooring rope. They will be tracking that everywhere, Hamish thought idly, making a mental note of the mess. The cold wind picked up again, cutting right through Hamish's thin uniform tunic. The chill made him think fondly of his kitchen back at the police station. He longed for a simple, quiet meal. A hot bowl of homemade fish chowder and a thick slice of buttered bread sounded like absolute heaven. It was certainly better than the dreadful, grey, tasteless food forced upon officers at the Strathbane police canteen. A miserable place Hamish avoided, as though it harboured the plague. Toland finally finished his lecture to young Tommy and tapped his clipboard aggressively. "I will be inspecting every single inch of this harbour over the next 48 hours, Toland announced to the silent, glaring fisherman. "Do not think you can hide your laziness or your shortcuts from me. I am going to the harbour office to review the financial logs, and then I expect full cooperation." He turned and marched back up the slipway, leaving a heavy trail of angry mutters and dark looks in his wake. Hamish looked down at Lugs. The dog had not moved a single muscle, perfectly content to ignore the human drama. "Well, Lugs," Hamish murmured, reaching down to scratch the dog behind his odd ears. "I have a terrible feeling that man is going to find exactly what he is looking for, and none of us are going to like the result." Chapter 2. High Standards, Low Tempers. The late afternoon drizzle began as a fine, irritating mist before sharpening into a needly cold rain. It blew straight off the grey waters of the sea loch, driving the villagers of Lochs indoors. Hamish Macbeth stood in his small kitchen at the police station, staring gloomily out of the window. The smell of peat smoke drifted down from the chimney, mingling warmly with the scent of a bubbling pot of mince and tatties on the stove. It was a simple, hearty meal, and just the thought of it was a comfort compared to the dismal grey stew forced upon officers at the Strathbane police canteen, which always tasted faintly of wet cardboard and despair. Lugs was currently sprawled like an old hearth rug directly in front of the warm stove, utterly impervious to the miserable weather outside. Sonsie had vanished earlier, but Hamish caught a sudden glimpse of wild yellow eyes staring from the top of the high kitchen cupboards. The Wildcat watched him for a second, then blinked and melted back into the shadows. Before Hamish could serve his dinner, a loud, urgent knocking rattled the front door of the police station. He sighed, turned off the heat under his pot, and went to answer it. Nessie and Jessie Curry stood on the doorstep. The two spinster sisters clutched their umbrellas like battle shields against the driving rain. "Hamish Macbeth," Nessie announced breathlessly, shaking water from her coat. "You had better get down to the pub this instant. That terrible inspector is tearing strips off you and McRae in the back room." "Tearing strips," Jessie echoed, her eyes wide behind her thick spectacles. "He is looking at the Harbour cooperative books," Nessie continued, her voice dropping to a thrilling conspiratorial whisper. "He says there are irregular fuel receipts and unusual night landings. He is calling Ewan a thief in all but name." "A thief!" Jessie agreed eagerly. Information in Lochs always travelled through the gossip network far faster than any official police channel. Hamish knew the sisters had likely heard the news at Patel's General Store, where rumours multiplied among the grocery shelves. Ewan McRae was the treasurer of the Harbour Cooperative. He was a polished, quietly efficient man who managed the village's small fishing economy with a helpful smile. If Graham Toland was openly accusing Ewan of corruption, the entire village would soon be in an uproar. "Thank you, ladies," Hamish said mildly, reaching for his uniform cap. I will go and make sure the peace is being kept." Hamish walked down the wet, shining street toward the local pub. The needly rain bit at his face, and a thick fog bank was beginning to roll in heavily from the sea, swallowing the edges of the harbour in a dense white haze. Inside the pub, the main bar was unusually quiet. A dozen locals were nursing their pints of heavy beer, sitting in tense silence. Their heads were angled toward the closed wooden door of the back room, listening intently to the muffled sounds of an argument. Hamish offered a brief nod to the bartender and walked softly toward the back room. He pushed the door open just a fraction of an inch and listened. Ewan McCrae sat at a small, ring-stained table. His normally perfectly combed hair looked a bit ruffled, and his jaw was tight. Graham Tolland stood over him, tapping a thick pen against his aluminium clipboard in a slow, maddening rhythm. "You cannot explain these massive fuel discrepancies," Tolland snapped, his voice sharp and carrying perfectly through the crack in the door. "Nor can you explain these logged night landings when the catch reports show absolutely nothing. It is a systematic failure of compliance, Mr. McCrae. It points directly to off-the-books trading." "It is a small community, Mr. Tolland," Ewan said, keeping his voice carefully reasonable. "Sometimes a boat comes in late to avoid a storm, and the paperwork simply catches up the next day. There is no grand conspiracy here." "I do not deal in your pathetic Highland excuses," Tolland replied coldly. "I deal in strict regulations. The books are a disgrace, and your physical standards out there in the water are just as appalling. That marker, Buoy 7, is completely out of position. It is a navigational hazard." "The tide pulls the chains," Ewan said smoothly, though his hands were gripped tightly together on the table. "We will look at the moorings tomorrow morning when the weather clears." "I am not waiting for tomorrow," Tolland barked, leaning closer to Ewan. "If you refuse to inspect the moorings, I will hire a dinghy and check the buoy myself tonight." "Standards do not sleep, Mr. McCrae, and neither do I." Hamish closed the door silently and stepped back into the main bar. He felt a sharp ache behind his eyes. The threat of a promotion to a desk job in Inverness hovered in his mind like a dark, suffocating cloud. Chief Inspector Blair would use any excuse to get Hamish out of Lochs. If Tolland filed an official report claiming the local policeman ignored rampant harbour corruption, Blair would seize upon it instantly. He would either drag Hamish to Strathbane for disciplinary action, or push the Inverness promotion through just to be rid of him. Hamish needed to manage this situation quietly, before it exploded. He stepped out of the pub and looked toward the water. The rain had stopped, but the fog had thickened dramatically. It hung over the loch like a heavy wool blanket. Somewhere out there in the damp, blinding dark, Buoy 7 was bobbing on the current. Hamish turned up his collar against the chill and walked slowly back toward his cold dinner, wishing desperately that the inspector would simply pack his clipboard and leave them all in peace. Chapter 3. Fog Before Breakfast. Dawn broke over Lochs, not with the golden light of morning, but with a creeping, freezing fog. The thick white haze rolled off the sea loch and swallowed the harbour entirely. Above the invisible water, gulls cried out blindly, their harsh, frantic calls completely muffled by the dense atmosphere. The scent of salt, wet stone, and decaying seaweed hung heavily in the damp air. Hamish Macbeth stood in his small, cold kitchen at the police station, shivering slightly in his uniform trousers and undershirt as he waited for the ancient kettle to boil. The fuse had threatened to trip twice already. He was desperately craving a proper, hot bowl of thick oats, with a generous splash of cream and a spoonful of dark honey. It was a simple, quiet comfort, but infinitely superior to the greasy, grey, unidentifiable fried sludge that was passed off as breakfast at the Strathbane police canteen. The mere memory of that dismal canteen food made Hamish shudder. He poured boiling water into a mug of strong tea and looked down at the floor. Lugs remained firmly asleep in his woven basket near the stove. The large, oddly shaped dog was snoring softly, looking as lazy and immovable as an old hearth rug. Lugs had absolutely no intention of facing the freezing mist outside. Sunsy, however, was wide awake. The Wildcat sat by the back door, staring at Hamish with fierce, untamed yellow eyes. She let out a low, demanding noise in the back of her throat, completely intolerant of closed doors when there was a territory to patrol. "All right, you terrible beast," Hamish murmured, pulling on his uniform tunic and reaching for his peaked cap. "But do not come crying to me when your paws get frozen." Hamish opened the back door, and the chill bit instantly through his clothing. Sonsie darted past his boots and vanished silently into the grey mist. Hamish followed slowly, deciding a quick walk along the waterfront might clear his head before the village woke. He needed to think about the dreadful marine assessor, Graham Tolland, and the looming threat of an unwanted promotion to a city desk in Inverness. The fog distorted the familiar village street. The neat row of whitewashed cottages looked like pale ghosts, and the heavy silence was broken only by the rhythmic, hollow lapping of the dark tide against the harbour walls. As Hamish neared the edge of the secondary slipway, Sonsie reappeared from the white haze. She stopped at the top of the stone ramp, her ears flattened against her sleek skull, and let out a sharp, warning hiss. Hamish quickened his pace, his rubber-soled boots slipping slightly on the damp cobblestones. He reached the slipway and stopped. Graham Tolland was lying face down near the cold edge of the dark water. There was no blood and no dramatic gore. There was simply the profound, heavy wrongness of a human body, made entirely still. Tolland still wore his pristine, bright yellow, waterproof jacket, though the harsh colour was now muted by a fine, heavy layer of morning condensation. His aluminum clipboard lay submerged in a shallow puddle a few feet away. Hamish knelt carefully beside the man and pressed 2 fingers against the cold, stiff neck. There was no pulse. The man had been dead for hours. Hamish sat back on his heels, his hazel eyes scanning the immediate area with sharp intelligence. The tide had washed over the lower half of the slipway during the night, smoothing the grit and shifting the loose seaweed. However, Hamish noticed a thick, heavy mooring rope lying near the body. The rough fibres showed fresh, deep scuffing along a stretch of about 4 feet, as if the rope had been pulled hard against the stone under a significant, dragging weight. The sea moved things constantly, Hamish knew, but the sea did not drag heavy objects in a deliberate, straight line. He turned his attention back to the body. On the right cuff of Tolland's bright yellow sleeve, Hamish spotted a damp, dark smear. He leaned in closer, squinting in the poor light. The smear was sticky, and it had a very faint, distinct green tint. Before Hamish could ponder the green mark further, a sharp gasp echoed loudly through the fog. He looked up to see Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, standing at the top of the slipway. She gripped her sensible wooden walking stick tightly, her face entirely pale beneath her woolen hat. "Is that the terrible inspector man?" she asked, her voice trembling loudly in the quiet air. "It is, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said calmly, standing up and blocking her view of the body. "I must ask you to go back to the manse immediately, and please, do not speak of this dreadful business to anyone just yet." Hamish knew it was a completely futile request. Information in Lochs flowed like water down a steep hill. Mrs. Wellington would undoubtedly march straight past the Free Church and accidentally bump into the Curry sisters. Within 15 minutes, the news would reach Patel's general store. The entire village would soon know that the hateful compliance assessor was dead on the slippery stones. Hamish walked briskly to the harbour master's office, forced the lock on the door, and used the landline telephone to call police headquarters in Strathbane. 2 hours later, the fog had thinned only slightly, but the peace of the Highland morning was thoroughly shattered. 2 large police cars roared blindly down the single-track road, their tyres throwing wet gravel against the stone walls as they screeched to a halt near the pier. Chief Inspector Blair climbed heavily out of the lead vehicle. He was a thickly built man with a permanent scowl, a terrible temper, and a complexion the colour of raw beef. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing air, and puffing furiously on a cigarette, stomping down the wooden planks as if he could simply bully the mist into clearing by shouting at it. "What is this absolute nonsense, Macbeth?" Blair barked, staring down at the yellow-clad body with undisguised annoyance. The stupid man slipped in the fog and cracked his skull. "It is a simple, clumsy accident. Why have you dragged me out of my bed for a dead tourist?" "He was not a tourist, sir," Hamish replied mildly, his hands resting easily in his pockets. "His name was Graham Tolland. He was a marine compliance assessor. Yesterday afternoon, he publicly threatened to shut down half the fishing boats in this village. He also cornered the harbour treasurer and accused the local cooperative of falsifying their financial books." Blair stopped dead. The cigarette dropped from his thick lips and hissed softly as it hit the wet stone. His small, dark eyes suddenly gleamed with malicious, hungry joy. "Threaten the locals, did he?" Blair said, a very nasty smile spreading slowly across his heavy face. "Well now, Macbeth, that changes things entirely. This is no accident. This is murder. One of your savage, backward fishermen finally lost his temper in the dark." "We do not know that for certain, sir," Hamish said, keeping his voice deliberately flat. "The stone on the slipway is very slippery in the dark." "Do not try to protect them, you lazy fool," Blair sneered, turning his massive shoulders to survey the fog-shrouded village. "I am going to tear this miserable place apart until someone confesses to this crime. And if you get in my way, or try to hide your friends, I will personally see you transferred to a tiny desk in Inverness before the week is finished." Blair immediately began shouting aggressive orders at his uniformed detectives, loudly assigning blame for sport before a single photograph had been taken or a piece of evidence collected. Hamish stood quietly by the edge of the dark water, listening to the heavy boots of the Strathbane policemen echoing loudly on the pier. The thick fog distorted the noise, making every single footstep in the harbour sound distinctly guilty. He thought about the faint green smear on the dead man's sleeve, and the scuffed rope on the slipway, and he wondered with a heavy heart who Chief Inspector Blair would choose to destroy first. Chapter 4. Canteen Grey, Chowder Gold. The police canteen in Strathbane smelled permanently of boiled cabbage, strong bleach, and old frying oil. Hamish Macbeth stared bleakly down at his assigned plate. It held a grey, rubbery sausage, a pool of watery baked beans, and a slice of toast that resembled damp cardboard. He pushed the plate away, feeling his stomach rebel at the mere sight of it. Across the small plastic table, Chief Inspector Blair was eating with loud, enthusiastic greed. Blair shoved a heavy forkful of greasy egg into his mouth and chewed noisily. "This is my ticket, Macbeth," Blair boasted loudly, spraying small crumbs of toast across the table. "A murdered government official! The press will be swarming all over it by tomorrow." "When I solve this, I will be the absolute hero of the Highlands." Hamish said nothing. He simply watched the terrible food congealing on his plate. "You will stay entirely out of my way," Blair continued, pointing a thick, greasy finger at Hamish. "I know exactly how you work. You protect your backward little friends and hide evidence. If you interfere with my investigation, I will have you transferred to a desk in Inverness before Friday." Hamish nodded slowly. He stood up, left the miserable canteen without another word, and climbed into his police Land Rover to drive the long, winding road back to Loch. The drive immediately calmed his frayed nerves. The heavy morning fog was finally lifting from the glens, leaving the rolling hills completely slick and shining with rain. The deep purple heather glowed brightly against the dark, wet stone of the mountains. When he finally saw the silver waters of the sea loch reflecting the pale afternoon sky, he felt a profound sense of relief. Back in the warmth of his own police station kitchen, Hamish finally found true comfort. He heated a large pot of rich golden fish chowder he had purchased earlier from the local pub. The wonderful smell of smoked haddock, fresh cream, and soft potatoes filled the small room. He tore off a thick chunk of crusty bread, sat at the wooden table, and let the real cooking revive his spirits. Lugs immediately abandoned his woven basket. The large dog sat closely beside Hamish, resting his heavy, ugly head right on Hamish's knee. Lugs begged with the tragic, soulful eyes of a seasoned professional who had not eaten a decent meal in weeks. Sonsia appeared silently on the edge of the counter. The Wildcat snatched a small piece of fallen fish from the chopping board. With a sudden flash of untamed yellow eyes, she vanished out of the back window, looking exactly as if she were conducting her own private inquiries into the murder. After finishing his chowder, Hamish walked down the village street to Patel's general store to buy a packet of tea. The small shop was crowded. The Loch gossip network was already operating at maximum efficiency. Nessie Curry was holding a tin of garden peas, speaking in a loud, dramatic whisper to Mrs. Wellington near the counter. Mr. Patel was calmly ringing up groceries, pretending not to listen. He had secret appointments, Nessie announced breathlessly. Tolland's diary was lying right on his desk in the Harbour office. Young Tommy saw it through the window before the Strathbane police locked the door. "Appointments in the middle of the night?" Mrs. Wellington asked, her eyes wide with scandal. "Exactly," Jessie Curry chimed in from behind her sister. In the dead of night. 3 names were written down for late last night. Nessie nodded firmly. Ewan McRae, that oily councillor from the tourism board, and Archie McLean. Hamish quietly paid Mr. Patel for his tea and stepped back outside into the damp air. He walked purposefully toward the waterfront. He soon spotted Archie McLean sitting on a wooden crate near the seawall. The big fisherman was mending a torn net, but his thick hands were clumsy, and he looked entirely exhausted. Hamish approached him with a slow, gentle step. Archie, Hamish said softly, keeping his voice entirely neutral. The village is saying your name was in Tolland's diary for a late meeting last night. Archie's head snapped up. His weathered face went pale beneath his ruddy complexion, and his hands began to shake slightly against the netting. I never met him, Archie said quickly, his voice tight and breathless with rising panic. I was at home asleep in my own bed. The man was a cruel tyrant, Hamish. But I did not kill him. Archie looked thoroughly rattled. Hamish believed the fisherman was genuinely frightened of Chief Inspector Blair. However, as Hamish looked at the panic in the older man's eyes, he was not entirely sure Archie was telling the complete truth. Chapter 5. Blair chooses his favourite scapegoat. The pale light of the sea loch did little to warm the damp air. A sharp wind blew steadily off the water, carrying the heavy scent of salt and old seaweed. The village of Lochs had turned the harbour into a quiet, tense theatre. Villagers hovered at a safe distance near the wooden sheds, pulling their woolen coats tight against the biting chill. Hamish Macbeth stood near the edge of the pier, digesting a hot venison pasty he had bought from Patel's general store. The rich, flaky pastry and spiced meat were a profound comfort. It was a sharp contrast to the terrible, grey, lukewarm sludge that the Strathbane police canteen dared to call food. The mere memory of that canteen made his stomach churn. The local gossip network had already broadcast the morning's events. Nessie and Jessie Curry stood behind a stack of empty lobster creels, their eyes bright with anticipation behind their thick spectacles. The sisters whispered furiously to each other, acting as the unofficial narrators for the unfolding drama. Chief Inspector Blair had found his target. He stood in the centre of the pier, his heavy face flushed purple with exertion and fury. He had cornered Archie McLean against the rough wooden planks of the harbour office. "Do not talk to me about fishermen and their honesty," Blair sneered loudly, his voice echoing across the water. "You are all a pack of liars. You hated the man, McLean. He was going to shut down your pathetic little boat, so you smashed his head in." "I was in my bed," Archie rumbled, his large, calloused hands resting heavily at his sides. "I did not touch the inspector." Blair stepped closer, thrusting his thick jaw toward the older man. "We have your name in his diary," Blair shouted, clearly enjoying his audience. "You had a secret meeting. And now the man is dead on the Slipway. Confess now, or I will have your boat seized and impounded by sunset." Hamish walked slowly toward the confrontation. Lugs trailed behind him and immediately collapsed onto the damp planks, sprawling like an old hearthrug right in the middle of the walkway. From the corrugated roof of the harbour shed, Sonsie watched the scene, her untamed, wild yellow eyes fixed unblinkingly on the loud Strathbane policeman. As Hamish approached, he looked carefully at the ground. He studied the heavy, black rubber boots Archie was wearing. They were thickly caked with ordinary, dark brown harbour muck, bits of silver fish scale, and sticky black tar. Hamish narrowed his eyes. There was absolutely no trace of fresh green paint on the boots. If Archie had met Tolland near Buoy 7 during the night, he would have brushed against the freshly painted metal. The tacky green paint would have left those distinctive crescent chips on the fisherman's boots or his thick canvas trousers. Archie was entirely clean of the motif. "I will ruin you, McLean," Blair bellowed, spittle flying from his heavy lips. "You will never fish these waters again. I will make sure of it." Hamish felt a cold, hard knot tighten in his chest. He could not abide cruelty for the sake of a public spectacle. "That is quite enough, sir," Hamish said. His Highland lilt had vanished entirely. His voice became suddenly sibilant. It was soft, sharp, and entirely dangerous. The quiet hiss carried perfectly over the sound of the wind. Blair stopped mid-shout and turned slowly. He blinked at the tall, red-haired sergeant. The villagers, holding their breath near the sheds, suddenly stood very still. "Are you interfering with my interrogation, Macbeth?" Blair demanded, though his voice had lost a fraction of its bluster. "I am reminding you of procedure, sir," Hamish said, his tone still deadly quiet. "You cannot seize a man's livelihood without a formal warrant or a scrap of physical evidence tying him to the scene. Archie MacLean has given his statement. Bullying him in the open air will not solve your murder." Blair glared at Hamish with pure hatred. He knew Hamish was right, and he hated him even more for pointing it out in front of the village. "I am watching you, MacLean," Blair snapped, turning back to the fisherman. "Do not try to leave this village." Blair stormed away down the pier, his heavy boots stamping furiously against the wood. He kicked angrily at a loose pebble, barely missing Lugs, who simply snored and refused to move. Archie let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the shed. He looked at Hamish, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound relief and lingering fear. "Thank you, Hamish," Archie muttered softly. "The man is a monster." "Go home, Archie," Hamish said gently, his voice returning to its normal, mild rhythm. "Stay inside with your wife, and keep out of his way." Hamish turned and looked out over the grey water. The fog had finally cleared, but the atmosphere remained heavy and dark. He knew Blair would not simply drop the matter. The Chief Inspector had chosen his scapegoat, and he would dig his claws in until he drew blood. Hamish needed to find out exactly how Graham Tolland ended up on that slipway, before Archie paid the price for a crime he clearly did not commit. Chapter 6. The Green Chip That Shouldn't Travel. The heavy grey fog lingered stubbornly over the dark water of the sea loch. It felt less like normal Highland weather and more like a silent, deliberate accomplice to murder. A sharp wind blew down from the damp heather on the hills, carrying the bitter scent of salt, whetstone, and old peat smoke. Hamish Macbeth walked quietly into the small harbour office. The Strathbane detectives had gone up to the local pub for their afternoon pints, leaving the room completely unguarded and messy. Lugs followed Hamish inside. The large, heavy dog immediately dropped into the narrow doorway. He sprawled like an old hearthrug across the threshold, firmly blocking anyone from entering or leaving. Sonsie appeared silently on the wooden windowsill outside. Her wild yellow eyes stared through the dirty glass for a brief second. Then, with a flick of her dark tail, she vanished into the thick mist, acting entirely like a creature who knew all the harbour secrets but refused to share them. Hamish looked at the cluttered wooden desk and felt a sudden, sharp pang of hunger. He thought longingly of a hot, savoury mutton pie from the local Italian restaurant. A proper meal in Loch was a profound comfort. It was the exact opposite of the dreadful food served at the Strathbane police canteen. The canteen pies resembled grey, heavy bricks filled with unidentifiable gristle, and they tasted entirely of cold despair. Through the cracked window frame, Hamish heard a familiar, shrill voice. Nessie Curry was standing outside Patel's general store, speaking loudly to the village postman. Her voice carried perfectly on the damp wind. She was confidently explaining exactly how Archie MacLean had planned a brutal murder. The Loch Gossip Network was working relentlessly, trying and convicting the poor fisherman faster than a judge ever could. Hamish sighed and turned his attention to a clear plastic evidence bag carelessly left on a side table. It contained Graham Tolland's bright yellow waterproof jacket. Chief Inspector Blair had tossed it aside, likely considering it nothing more than damp weather gear. Hamish carefully opened the unsealed plastic bag. He lifted the right sleeve and closely examined the dark smear he had noticed on the slipway that morning. Lodged deeply inside the stitched seam of the waterproof cuff was a tiny distinct object. Hamish gently prized it out with his thumbnail and held it up to the pale light. It was a small crescent chip of fresh green paint. The paint was still slightly tacky to the touch. It was identical to the thick paint the harried harbour worker had applied to Buoy 7 the previous afternoon. Hamish carefully placed the green chip into a small paper envelope and tucked it into his uniform tunic pocket. He left the office, stepping over his peacefully snoring dog, and walked slowly down to the very edge of the slipway. He knelt on the cold, wet stone, exactly where the dead man had been found. He ran his bare hand along the metal safety rails and the heavy wooden mooring posts. The paint on the slipway rails was extremely old. It was heavily weathered by salt and storms, peeling away in dry, flat flakes of dull grey and rust. There was absolutely no fresh green paint anywhere near the stone ramp. Hamish stood up and stared out into the blinding white mist over the water. Graham Tolland could not have acquired that fresh green paint chip on the Slipway. The tacky green crescent meant Tolland had definitely touched Buoy 7 during the night. The angry inspector had kept his promise to audit the moorings in the dark. "You did not fall here," Hamish said softly to the empty air. The Slipway was not the site of a clumsy accident. It was a staged dumping ground. Someone had met Tolland at the buoy. Something terrible had happened, and the body had been deliberately dragged back to the shore. Hamish shoved his cold hands deep into his pockets. He had found a crucial piece of the puzzle, but he knew the truth would be incredibly dangerous to uncover. Chapter 7. Hamish's quiet fix goes loud. The damp grass along the edges of the single-track road was heavy with freezing dew. The pale morning loch light struggled to pierce the thick, bruised clouds hanging over the hills. The scent of sharp peat smoke drifted down from the cottage chimneys, mingling with the ever-present smell of salt and wet stone. Hamish Macbeth walked briskly away from Archie McLean's small cottage. He had gone there early, before the village fully woke, to offer the terrified fishermen a piece of quiet advice. Hamish had suggested Archie stay indoors for a day or two and mend his nets by the kitchen fire, safely out of sight. Hamish needed time to check the Harbour Cooperative logbooks without Chief Inspector Blair finding an excuse to arrest Archie for simply breathing near the water. It was meant to be a kindness, a protective shield against Blair's spectacular cruelty. Feeling slightly more hopeful, Hamish turned his steps toward Patel's general store. His stomach was rumbling fiercely. He bought a large, hot sausage roll from Mrs. Patel. The flaky pastry and richly spiced meat provided immediate, intense comfort. He savoured the hot food, shuddering at the memory of the Strathbane police canteen, where the sausage rolls resembled cold lumps of grey rubber and tasted faintly of old cardboard. He stepped back outside to eat, but his peaceful breakfast was instantly ruined. The Lochs gossip network was moving like a wildfire in dry heather. A long queue had formed outside the shop, and Nessie Curry was holding court near the display of bruised apples. "He is hiding from the law," Nessie announced loudly to the captive audience. "Archie McLean did not take his boat out this morning. The sea is perfectly calm, yet his boat is tied tight to the pier. He is locked in his house." "Locked in," Jessie Curry echoed, nodding her head vigorously. Guilt written all over him. "It is a terrible shame," Mrs. Wellington said, clutching her heavy shopping bag. "I had an order in for 3 large haddock for the minister's supper. I have cancelled it, of course." "One cannot buy fish from a man who batters government inspectors in the dark?" "Certainly not," Nessie agreed righteously. "And I hear the McLean family have told Archie he is no longer convenient for their Sunday dinner. You cannot sit at the table with a murderer." Hamish stopped chewing. A cold wave of dismay washed over him. In Lochs, a rumour could ruin a man far quicker than a winter storm. By simply trying to keep Archie out of Blair's line of sight, Hamish had accidentally confirmed the village's worst suspicions. The villagers saw Archie hiding, and their active imaginations immediately filled in the blanks with blood and guilt. He looked down. Lugs had collapsed directly in front of the shop door, entirely ignoring the chattering women. The heavy dog was sprawled like an old hearthrug across the damp pavement, forcing the customers to step carefully over his sleeping form. Above them, on the edge of the shop awning, Sonzi crouched low. Her untamed, wild yellow eyes tracked the movement of the gossiping villagers with silent, predatory judgment. Hamish tossed the last bite of his sausage roll to Lugs, who swallowed it without opening his eyes. "Ladies," Hamish said mildly, stepping toward the queue, "Archie McLean is simply taking a rest. There is no need to boycott a man who has fed this village for 30 years. Nessie sniffed loudly and adjusted her spectacles. "There is no smoke without fire, Hamish Macbeth. Even you cannot protect a guilty man forever." The witnesses were already clamming up. As Hamish walked down toward the Harbour Cooperative notice board, he noticed the harbour workers actively turning their backs to him. They were terrified of the gossip, terrified of being associated with Archie, and utterly terrified of Chief Inspector Blair's shouting. Hamish realised his quiet fix had widened the fog of suspicion instead of clearing it. "Macbeth!" The roar echoed off the stone walls of the harbour office. Chief Inspector Blair stomped down the slipway, his heavy face glowing a dangerous mottled purple. He marched straight up to Hamish. jabbing a thick finger into the air. "I know exactly what you are doing," Blair sneered, his small eyes bright with malice. "You told the prime suspect to lock himself in his house. You are deliberately obstructing a murder investigation to protect your backward friends." "I suggested he avoid the harbour so you would not harass him without cause, sir," Hamish replied, his Highland lilt dangerously soft. "It does not matter," Blair laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The whole village knows he is guilty now. Even they have turned against him. You have painted him right into a corner, and when I slap the cuffs on him, I will make sure headquarters in Inverness hears all about your little attempts to hide him." Blair leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and cheap mints. "They are looking for a new desk sergeant in Inverness right now," Blair whispered happily. "They want someone to manage the files in a nice, windowless room. I have already put your name at the very top of the list. By the time this week is out, you will be packing your bags, Macbeth." Blair turned and swaggered back up the pier, looking thoroughly delighted with himself. Hamish stood alone by the notice board, the cold wind biting at his face. The threat of the promotion felt heavier and more real than ever before. He had to find the true owner of that tiny green paint chip, and he had to do it before Archie's life in the village was destroyed completely. Chapter 8. A solution too convenient. The local pub was crowded and noisy at lunchtime. The air inside was thick with the smell of spilled heavy ale, damp wool collars, and the smoke of a roaring coal fire. Outside the small, smudged windows, the weather remained miserable. The fog had thinned slightly, but the pale loch light offered absolutely no warmth. The bitter cold drove the villagers indoors, where they eagerly sought the comfort of easy answers. Hamish Macbeth sat alone in a quiet corner booth. He was slowly eating a large, steaming plate of shepherd's pie. The rich, minced lamb, dark gravy, and perfectly crisp potato topping provided a profound comfort against the gloomy day. It was a massive improvement over the dreadful meals served at the Strathbane police canteen. The canteen pie always resembled a grey, watery puddle of unidentifiable gristle, and it tasted exactly like salted cardboard. Lugs had followed his master inside. The large, odd-looking dog immediately found the warmest spot near the pub fireplace. He collapsed heavily onto the floor, sprawling like an old hearth rug, completely ignoring the noisy chatter of the crowded room. Through the pub window, Hamish saw a quick flash of movement on the street. Sonsie sat proudly on top of a wooden barrel. Her untamed, wild yellow eyes glared fiercely at the patrons through the glass before she turned and vanished back into the biting wind. Chief Inspector Blair stood near the wooden bar, holding a large pint glass. He looked immensely pleased with himself, his heavy face flushed with triumph. The Lochs gossip network had essentially done his police work for him. The murmurs flowing through the pub were nearly unanimous. Everyone was desperate for a quick resolution, even if it meant sacrificing their only fisherman. Nessie and Jessie Curry sat at a small table nearby, nursing 2 glasses of sweet sherry. "It was a tragic loss of temper," Nessie announced to the room, shaking her head sadly. Archie McLean met the inspector on the Slipway in the dark. They argued about the boat inspections. Archie shoved him, and the man fell. "Fell on the stone," Jessie echoed, taking a small sip of her drink. "Exactly," Blair said loudly, turning to address the pub. "It is perfectly obvious. McLean lost his temper, the inspector hit his head, and the tide did the rest. It is a simple, brutal case of manslaughter. I will have the warrant signed by this evening." Several villagers nodded quietly into their beer glasses. They did not actually want Archie to go to a cold prison cell, but they wanted the terrible village tension to end even more. If Archie was arrested, the frightening Strathbane detectives would finally pack their cars and leave Lochs in peace. Hamish sat very still in his booth. He felt a sudden, heavy temptation to simply agree with the chief inspector. It was an incredibly tidy theory. A sudden, angry shove in the dark was entirely believable. Archie was a large, strong man with a fiery temper when pushed. If Hamish simply endorsed this easy answer, the case would be officially closed before supper. Chief Inspector Blair would claim all the local glory and return immediately to his miserable city. Most importantly, headquarters in Inverness would lose all interest in the matter. They would not see Hamish as a brilliant, efficient detective. They would cancel their dreadful plans to promote him to a loud, windowless desk job. Hamish could stay in his beloved Highland village forever. He nearly accepted the convenient lie just to save his own quiet life. Then, the easy answers, warming the crowded room, suddenly turned entirely cold in his mind. Hamish reached slowly into his uniform tunic pocket. His long fingers brushed against the small paper envelope. It contained the tiny crescent chip of fresh green paint he had pulled from the dead man's waterproof cuff. He thought carefully about Archie Maclean's fishing gear. That morning, Hamish had looked very closely at the older man's heavy ropes, his boots, and his thick canvas work gloves. They were covered entirely in thick black tar, dried white salt, and ordinary brown grime. There was absolutely no trace of tacky green paint anywhere on Archie's boat or his clothing. Furthermore, Hamish knew the harbour waters intimately. Buoy 7 marked a treacherous, jagged underwater reef. Archie Maclean always actively avoided that specific metal marker. The jagged rocks beneath it routinely snagged and destroyed his expensive fishing nets. Archie would never choose to steer his boat anywhere near Buoy 7 in the middle of a blinding, dangerous fog. The tiny green paint chip firmly insisted upon the truth. Graham Tolland did not die from a random argument on the stone slipway. The crucial moment of violence had happened exactly at Buoy 7, out in the freezing dark of the harbour water. Someone else had deliberately lured the angry inspector to that freshly painted marker. Someone who was not afraid of the reef. Hamish pushed his empty plate away. The tidy theory had completely collapsed. Archie was innocent. Blair was entirely wrong. And the real killer was still sitting comfortably somewhere in Loch. The murderer was happily letting the village gossip network tear an innocent man apart. Hamish stood up, his hazel eyes completely hard and focused. He could not hide behind a convenient lie, no matter how much he dreaded a promotion to the city. He walked quietly out of the pub, leaving the chief inspector to boast to an empty room, and headed back down to the cold water to find the truth. Chapter 9. Sonsy's Trophy. The wind howled fiercely off the dark waters of the sea loch. It swept heavily over the heather-covered hills and battered the stone walls of the Loch police station. The old building groaned under the relentless pressure. Rain lashed the window panes in angry horizontal sheets. It was a thoroughly miserable Highland night, and the damp chill was actively seeping into the marrow of Hamish Macbeth's bones. Hamish stood in his small kitchen and flicked the switch on his ancient electric kettle. Instantly, the machine sparked, and the entire kitchen plunged into absolute darkness. The fragile electrical fuse had tripped yet again. Hamish let out a long, tired sigh. He fumbled his way blindly into the narrow hallway, reset the heavy switch on the fuse box, and returned to the pale yellow light of the kitchen. He abandoned the complicated idea of making hot tea. Instead, he settled for a thick slice of rich, dark fruit cake he had purchased earlier that afternoon from Patel's general store. The cake was dense with plump raisins and heavy spices. It provided a profound, simple comfort against the bitter weather. He ate it slowly, shuddering slightly as his mind drifted to the dreadful desserts served at the Strathbane police canteen. The canteen cake always resembled a dry, yellow sponge normally used for washing police cars, and it tasted overwhelmingly of old dust and utter despair. The shrill, sudden ring of the landline telephone shattered the quiet of the room. Hamish picked up the receiver. "Hamish Macbeth," Nessie Curry's breathless voice announced immediately. "You must do something. The village is in an absolute state of panic." "Good evening, Nessie," Hamish said mildly, leaning against the counter. "What exactly is the state?" "It is Archie Maclean," she whispered loudly. The Loch gossip network was clearly working late into the stormy night. Chief Inspector Blair was drinking heavily in the pub this evening. He boasted to everyone in the main bar that he has a signed warrant from the magistrate. He is going to arrest Archie at first light. Jessie heard him say it with her own ears. He said it. Jessie's voice echoed faintly from a secondary telephone extension in the Curry household. "Thank you, ladies," Hamish replied, a cold knot of dread forming tightly in his stomach. "I will handle the chief inspector." He hung up the phone and looked down at the floor. Lugs was completely oblivious to the rising tension in the village. The large mongrel was sprawled like an old hearth rug across the linoleum, snoring heavily in front of the warm stove. The dog had absolutely no intention of moving until morning. If Blair arrested Archie at dawn, the fisherman's life would be effectively ruined. Even if a judge later cleared him of the murder charges, the dark stigma in a small Highland village would linger forever. The tourism board would completely shun him. The commercial fish buyers down in Inverness would cancel his contracts to avoid the bad press. Blair was going to destroy an innocent man merely to look efficient for the newspapers. Suddenly, a sharp, demanding scratch sounded at the back door. Hamish opened the heavy wooden door, bracing his shoulders against the biting wind. Sonsie trotted inside with an air of absolute smug purpose. Her sleek, dark fur was soaking wet, and her untamed, wild yellow eyes gleamed with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She stopped, right in the centre of the kitchen. With a deliberate tilt of her head, the Wildcat opened her jaws and dropped a solid object directly at Hamish's feet. It landed on the hard floor with a heavy, metallic clatter. Hamish knelt down and carefully picked the object up. It was a heavy, machined brass shackle pin. It was the exact type of thick metal pin used to secure the heavy mooring chains down in the village harbour. He turned the cold brass pin over under the harsh kitchen light. His breath hitched slightly in his throat. The thick threads of the heavy pin were smeared entirely with fresh green paint. Several sticky, crescent-shaped paint chips clung stubbornly to the metal grooves. Lugs finally woke up from his deep sleep. The dog shambled over, sniffed the brass pin thoroughly, and sneezed in profound disgust. Having offered his professional opinion on the evidence, Lugs immediately lumbered over to the single comfortable armchair, claimed the warm cushion, and went straight back to sleep as if that settled the entire matter. Hamish stared hard at the paint-smeared pin. The gloomy domestic misery of the evening met the sudden, sharp click of absolute certainty. This specific brass pin belonged to the mooring hardware of Buoy 7. Someone had deliberately unscrewed the shackle. They had tampered with the heavy chains, and they had done it recently enough to get the tacky green paint all over the metal threads in their own hands. Hamish sat down at the small kitchen table and began to piece the grim, violent picture together. Someone in Lochs was running a quiet, highly illegal smuggling operation. They were likely bringing in poached commercial shellfish or untaxed red diesel fuel in the dead of night. To do this silently in the dark and the heavy fog, they needed to slip a small boat in and out of the harbour without clanking heavy, noisy mooring chains together and waking the village. They had deliberately loosened the shackle on Buoy 7 to create a quick, silent release for their vessel. Graham Tolland had not simply gone for a walk on the Slipway. The inspector had discovered the tampered buoy during his relentless, aggressive daytime inspections. He had seen that the metal marker was deliberately out of position. Tolland had gone out onto the water in the freezing fog to check the moorings himself. The inspector had caught the smuggler red-handed out at the buoy. A violent struggle had broken out on a small boat. Tolland had been struck down. The killer could not possibly leave the dead body bobbing near the tampered buoy. That would immediately invite a massive marine investigation from the mainland authorities. So, the killer had hauled the body back to the shore and dragged it onto the stone slipway. They had staged a clumsy, fatal accident to throw the local police off the scent. The fresh green paint on the dead man's waterproof cuff matched the fresh green paint on the brass pin perfectly. It was unchangeable, undeniable proof. Archie McLean was entirely innocent. Hamish thought carefully about who had the access, the knowledge, and the smooth authority to manipulate the harbour logs. Ewan McCrae, the harbour cooperative treasurer, controlled the financial books. Ewan managed the fuel receipts. Ewan knew exactly when the local boats came and went. He was polished, highly respected, and deeply involved in the village economy. Tolland had publicly cornered Ewan in the pub, threatening to expose the massive fuel discrepancies. Ewan had everything to lose. Hamish slipped the brass pin into his pocket. The trap was set, but he needed a very public stage to spring it. He had to expose Ewan McCrae before Chief Inspector Blair ruined the wrong man at dawn. Chapter 10. The co-op meeting in the village hall. The village hall of Lochs smelled heavily of strong tea, floor wax, and damp wool. Outside, the early evening frost was already creeping across the window panes, turning the glass white against the dark Highland night. A bitter wind rattled the old wooden frames, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Hamish had called a mandatory meeting of the harbour cooperative under the guise of a formal safety clarification. The entire village had turned out. The Lochs gossip network had worked tirelessly all afternoon, ensuring that not a single folding chair remained empty. Nessie and Jessie Curry sat proudly in the front row, whispering furiously to Mrs. Wellington about exactly who was going to be arrested. Hamish stood quietly near the large tea urn at the front of the room. He took a thoughtful bite of a warm, buttery shortbread biscuit. The local baking was rich, crumbly, and deeply comforting. He thought briefly of the miserable, stale biscuits served at the Strathbane police canteen. Those dreadful things were so dry and hard they could easily be used as offensive weapons. He felt a profound gratitude for Lochs cooking. Lugs was safely tucked under the head table. The large dog was sprawled exactly like an old hearth rug, entirely asleep and completely ignoring the anxious villagers. High above, perched dangerously on the heavy wooden rafters, Sonsie watched the crowd below. Her untamed, wild yellow eyes gleamed fiercely in the shadows, tracking every nervous movement in the room. Ewan MacRae, the cooperative treasurer, sat comfortably near the front aisle. He looked polished, helpful, and completely calm. Archie MacLean sat near the back doors, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly on his knees. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors banged open. Chief Inspector Blair stormed into the hall. He smelled strongly of stale tobacco and cheap peppermints. His heavy face was flushed purple with the biting cold and his own aggressive self-importance. He marched straight down the centre aisle, his eyes fixed firmly on the frightened fisherman. "What is the meaning of this unauthorised gathering, Macbeth?" Blair shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the rafters. "I have a signed warrant in my pocket for Archie MacLean. I am taking him to Strathbane right now." Archie flinched violently. Several villagers gasped in shock. "You will do no such thing, sir," Hamish said. His Highland lilt vanished. His voice went completely sibilant. The soft, sharp hiss cut through the noisy hall like a polished blade. The room fell utterly, terribly silent. Even Blair stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in surprise at the dangerous tone. "You have the wrong man," Hamish continued softly. He stepped out from behind the tea table. He reached into his uniform tunic pocket and produced the heavy brass shackle pin. Archie MacLean was safely in his bed last night. The inspector did not die on the stone slipway. He died out on the water, at Buoy 7. Hamish held the cold brass pin high under the harsh fluorescent lights. "This pin secures the heavy mooring chains at that exact metal marker," Hamish explained to the silent room. It was deliberately loosened so a small boat could slip in and out of the harbour without clanking the heavy chains and waking the village. Someone was running untaxed red diesel and poached shellfish in the thick fog. Ewan MacRae shifted slightly in his folding chair. His polished, helpful smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. "Graham Tolland was a ruthless, thorough auditor," Hamish continued, his hazel eyes scanning the crowd. "He found the tampered buoy yesterday afternoon during his inspection. He went out in a borrowed dinghy last night to catch the smugglers. He caught them red-handed at the marker. A violent struggle occurred, and Tolland was struck down. The killer then dragged the heavy body back to the slipway to stage a clumsy, fatal accident." "This is complete fantasy, Macbeth!" Blair sneered loudly, though his small eyes were fixed intently on the brass pin. "It is physical proof, sir," Hamish corrected him mildly. "Buoy 7 was painted yesterday with thick, sticky green paint. It left distinctive, crescent-shaped chips on anything it touched. I found one of those tacky chips lodged deeply in the dead man's waterproof cuff." Hamish turned his gaze directly onto Ewan MacRae. The room followed his eyes. "The threads of this brass pin are heavily smeared with that exact same fresh green paint," Hamish said, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet hall. "And there are traces of it under your fingernails right now, Ewan. You manage the cooperative books. You seamlessly manipulate the fuel logs to hide the night landings. Tolland was going to expose the smuggling, ruin your reputation, and embarrass your political friends. You panicked." Ewan MacRae opened his mouth to speak, but the smooth, helpful words completely failed him. He looked desperately around the room. The village that had always respected his polished management now stared back at him with cold, hard realization. There were no grand theatrics. There was no dramatic confession. The immense social pressure of 50 witnesses pressing in on him was absolute. Under the terrible, heavy weight of a roomful of judging eyes, Ewan MacRae simply slumped forward in his folding chair, entirely defeated by the stubborn truth of a single paint chip. Chapter 11. Blair's Triumph, Hamish's Repair Work. The heavy frost of the previous night had finally melted. The morning sun cast a pale, clear loch light over the whitewashed cottages of Loch Dhu. The sharp scent of peat smoke mingled with the clean, bitter smell of the sea. The village street was slick and shining, and the familiar, stubborn rhythm of the Highlands slowly returned to the waterfront. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was entirely different. Chief Inspector Blair stood by the desk, shouting happily into the landline telephone. He was speaking directly to police headquarters in Inverness. "It was a complex smuggling ring, sir," Blair boasted loudly, puffing his heavy chest out. "I directed the entire operation from the very beginning. I tracked the paint transfers myself and broke the suspect down in front of the whole village. A total triumph for the Strathbane Division." Hamish Macbeth sat quietly at his small kitchen table, entirely ignoring the loud Chief Inspector. Hamish was eating a warm, soft roll filled with thick, crisp local bacon and dark brown sauce. The rich, salty meat was an absolute delight. It made him shudder to think of the Strathbane police canteen. The canteen cooks served bacon that resembled cold, grey rubber, tasting overwhelmingly of stale cooking oil and pure misery. Lugs lay on the floor near Hamish's chair. The large, heavy mongrel was sprawled like an old hearth rug, completely undisturbed by Blair's shouting. On top of the high wooden cupboards, Sunsy crouched low. Her untamed, wild yellow eyes tracked the Chief Inspector with silent, predatory disdain. Blair slammed the telephone receiver down and turned to Hamish with a massive, cruel grin. "They are very pleased with me, Macbeth," Blair sneered happily. "And I made sure to mention your adequate assistance. In fact, I told the superintendent that you are far too good for this wee place. They are pushing your promotion through the paperwork today. You will be sitting at a windowless desk in Inverness by next month." Blair laughed, a harsh, barking laugh, grabbed his heavy coat, and marched out of the station to boast to the waiting mainland press. Hamish felt a cold weight settle in his chest, but he pushed the anxiety away. He had urgent repair work to do in Loch Dhu. The arrest of Ewan MacRae had shattered the village's trust, and Hamish needed to mend the social fabric before it tore completely. He walked out onto the damp street. The Loch Dhu gossip network was already operating at terrifying speed. The news of Ewan's arrest had travelled faster than any official police statement. A tight knot of villagers stood outside Patel's general store, speaking in hushed, shocked tones. Hamish bypassed the shop and walked straight down to the cold, windy pier. Archie McLean was standing by his boat, staring silently out at the dark water. The big fisherman looked exhausted, but the terrible tension had finally left his broad shoulders. Hamish stood right beside him, making sure the watching villagers could clearly see the local policeman offering his public support. "It is a fine morning for the fishing, Archie," Hamish said mildly. "It is that, Hamish," Archie replied, his voice a low rumble. "The sea is quiet today." Slowly, the villagers began to approach. Highland pride rarely allowed for direct, spoken apologies. Instead, the restitution was practical and quiet. Nessie and Jessie Curry marched down the wooden planks. Nessie thrust a heavy tin of homemade shortbread into Archie's large hands. "You will be needing your strength for the nets, Archie," Nessie announced loudly, entirely ignoring her vicious accusations from the day before. "Your strength," Jessie echoed firmly. Archie nodded slowly and accepted the tin. It was the Loch Dhu equivalent of a profound, tearful apology. Hamish left them to their awkward peace and walked over to the harbour sheds. Young Tommy, the nervous deckhand, was violently scrubbing a plastic crate. He still looked deeply ashamed from the brutal public lecture Graham Tolland had given him. "Leave the crate, Tommy," Hamish said gently. The boy looked up, his face flushed red. "Mr. Tolland said I was a lazy disgrace, Sergeant Macbeth. He said I was a hazard to the whole harbour." Graham Tolland was a deeply angry man, looking for a soft target, Hamish corrected him smoothly. He was measuring this village against a ruler that did not exist. Ewan MacRae was the real hazard to this harbour, not you. Do your work carefully, listen to Archie, and you will be a fine sailor. Tommy blinked, and a small, relieved smile broke across his young face. Hamish turned and looked back up the slipway. The Strathbane detectives were hauling boxes of financial records out of the Harbour office. The cooperative books were finally going to be audited properly. The oily tourism counsellor, who had previously championed Ewan's false numbers, had conveniently retreated into total silence. The man had locked his doors and was refusing to answer his telephone. Hamish walked up the steep lane, leading away from the water. He saw Dr. Brodie and his wife, Angela, standing by their front gate. The doctor looked tired, but Angela offered a warm, brisk smile. "It is a terrible business, Hamish," Dr. Brodie said in his measured, dry voice. "Ewan MacRae always seemed so intensely respectable. It goes to show that a neat suit often hides a very messy soul." "He wanted the money and the quiet life," Hamish said. "When Toland threatened it, the panic simply took over." Angela thrust a brown paper bag into Hamish's hands. "You look completely exhausted, Hamish. I baked fresh fruit scones this morning. You must eat them and keep your strength up." Hamish smiled warmly, though his heart sank slightly at the weight of the paper bag. Angela Brodie was a deeply kind and compassionate woman, but she was a notoriously poor cook. Her scones usually possessed the density and destructive potential of a granite block. "Thank you, Angela," Hamish said politely. "I will have them with my tea." He continued up the lane, secretly planning to feed the rock-hard scones to the harbour gulls. The restoration of Loch was quiet and slow, lacking any grand drama. It felt exactly like a massive, heavy tide turning in the dark. The village was bruised, but the truth had finally settled the muddy waters. Hamish put his hands deep into his uniform pockets and walked slowly back to the police station. He had saved Archie MacLean, but as the bitter wind howled down the loch, he wondered desperately how he was going to save himself from the impending Inverness promotion. Chapter 12. The sea keeps its own time. Dusk settled slowly over the village of Loch. The heavy, blinding fog of the past few days was finally thinning out, leaving the Highland air sharp, clear, and bitterly cold. Out on the dark water, the metal bell of Buoy 7 chimed in a steady, ordinary rhythm, completely stripped of its deadly secret. The harbour had stubbornly returned to its normal, unhurried pace. The scheme was fully exposed, and Ewan MacRae was now sitting in a cold holding cell in Strathbane. The oily tourism counsellor had quietly resigned his post and left the village for a long, indefinite holiday. Hamish Macbeth sat quietly on a wooden bench near the end of the stone pier. He held a warm, steaming bowl of thick mutton broth he had coaxed from the local pub kitchen. The rich, peppery liquid and soft barley warmed his hands and settled his stomach. It was a profound comfort, entirely unlike the horrifying soup served at the Strathbane police canteen, which always resembled tepid, salty dishwater and smelled faintly of old shoes. The Loch gossip network was already busy rewriting local history. As Hamish ate his broth, he listened to the shrill voices of Nessie and Jessie Curry drifting down from the village street. "I always knew Ewan MacRae was too polished, to be honest," Nessie announced proudly to anyone who would listen. "He smiled too much for a man handling money." "Smiled too much," Jessie agreed, without a single trace of irony. They had entirely forgotten how eagerly they had condemned Archie MacLean only 2 days prior. The village simply closed ranks, adjusting the narrative to protect their own pride. Archie was out on the loch again, hauling his creels in peace, and young Tommy was learning to tie proper knots without being shouted at by a cruel inspector. Hamish looked down at the wooden bench. Lugs was completely ignoring the chilly evening wind. The large, heavy dog was sprawled exactly like an old hearthrug across the dry planks, snoring in a deep, oblivious sleep. High above them, perched gracefully on the corrugated iron roof of the harbour shed, Sonsie sat perfectly still. The Wildcat stared out across the dark water toward Buoy 7. Her untamed, wild yellow eyes gleamed with the intense satisfaction of a creature who had solved a complicated puzzle without ever lifting a single paw. Hamish reached into his uniform tunic pocket. He pulled out the tiny paper envelope and tipped it carefully into his palm. The small, crescent-shaped chip of fresh green paint rested against his skin. It was such a tiny, insignificant thing, yet it had been heavy enough to drag a murderer down. Hamish gently slid the paint chip back into the envelope and tucked it away in his pocket. He decided to keep it as a quiet reminder that the smallest trace of truth can easily outlast the biggest, loudest lie. The Highlands did not promise total peace, he knew. The wind would always bite, The sea would always be dangerous, and the village gossip would always be sharp, but there was a deep, persistent comfort in the familiar sounds of the loch. He finished his broth, listening to the water lapping against the stone. Chief Inspector Blair was still actively pushing for the Inverness promotion, and the threat circled Hamish like a hungry shark. He dreaded the thought of a city desk more than anything, but as he sat in the damp, freezing dusk of Lochdew, he knew he would fight with every ounce of his Highland stubbornness to stay exactly where he was. Lochdew will remember the week a stranger came to measure their lives and ended up measured himself. The harbour did not change, but the village did, if only a little. They became slightly slower to judge, and a bit quicker to notice exactly who profits from a sudden panic. That crescent chip of green paint looked like nothing at all. It was just a sticky fleck you might brush casually off your sleeve. But it became the stubborn truth marker, proving that small traces can expose big stories when people try to move the blame like stolen cargo in the fog. There is a vast difference between keeping high standards and using those standards as a cruel weapon. And when foolish pride and greedy money mix with dark secrecy, it is not the sea that is most dangerous. It is what ordinary people will do to stay perfectly respectable. Still, the kettle eventually boils, the wooden pier creaks, and someone will always hand you a warm bowl of soup when the winter wind bites. In the Highlands, comfort returns exactly the way the tide does. It comes back quietly, steadily, and right when it means to. When you are deciding what is true, do you trust loud, bold accusations, or the tiny detail that entirely refuses to fit the easy story? Thank you for joining me tonight. Please leave your thoughts and your answers in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, do leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a case. We will have another mystery waiting for you very soon. Until then, keep an eye on the fog. This is Oliver Finch, signing off from Highland Mystery.